I'm very well, thank you. And I think we're ready to start.
Wonderful.
Very good.
Hello. Okay. Hello and good morning to everybody. And really good to see you all. And great that you could be with us for the next 1 hour in discussing food poverty. My name is Bev Thomas, and I'm a trustee of the Trussell Trust. And let me introduce the guests that we have with us. First of all, we have Revie, who's the Chief Exec of the Trussell Trust. Marcia D Cordova, the Labour MP for Battersea. Kruger will be with us, the Conservative MP for Devizes constituency, and Paul Woolley, the CEO of London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. First of all, I'd like to say that this session will be recorded. It's part of a series of the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast webinars. And hopefully, we've only got 1 hour, so we're going to be very tight on time, but I'm sure we're going to hear some good things about the way forward. The need for food banks is at its highest level on record. What should the state, voluntary sector, faith, and specifically Christian community play in meeting people's basic needs? Churches play a major part in providing food banks here in the UK, but how might that role change to tackle the root causes and to work towards a future in which there is no need for a food bank? So before we start our discussion, let's pray for a moment. And it's just a simple prayer. Lord, help us to listen to each other so that we might understand your will and collectively seek wisdom for your glory. Amen. So may I hand over to Emma to start off with, please.
Thank you, Bev, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be with you all today. And I'd really like to add my welcome to Bev's and thank you for joining our webinar, which we're delighted to be hosting in partnership with the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast. As Bev said, churches are at the heart of our network across the UK, with more than 12,000 churches supporting our food banks. And during the past year, our network has provided over 2.5 million emergency food parcels to people in crisis. And without the support of local churches, this simply wouldn't have been possible. We are so grateful for all the support that is provided to our network by the Christian community. And yet we believe it isn't right that in a society as wealthy as ours, that so many people are needing to turn to food banks for the essentials. And we know that this belief is shared by many of the volunteers and staff in our network. This isn't what any of us would want for ourselves or for our families. Carrie, who has experience of poverty herself, said to us, "It's emotional feeling like you've literally hit the bottom, that you have to depend on other people to feed your kids." Levels of destitution are rising rapidly in the UK. And last year, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published data which showed that more than 1 million households were destitute at some point in 2019, and that the number of people experiencing destitution had increased by 52% in just 2 years since 2017. And those are the pre-pandemic figures. Our own state of hunger research showed that 95% of people being referred to food banks in our network are experiencing destitution, with an average household income of just £50 a week after rent. As Christians, this poses a really challenging question for us. How do we respond? Do we just continue to accept as normal the growth of emergency food aid in our country? Or do we speak up? Do we take a stand and say, we can do better than this for one another, that we need to do better than this for one another? At Trussell Trust, we remain absolutely committed to supporting the food banks in our network for as long as they're needed. But we are called in Hosea to maintain love and justice. And we need to be willing to be people who speak up too, People who ask why our society and our economy are working in such a way that millions of people can't make ends meet. We know that many people are facing much more difficult financial circumstances because of the impact of the pandemic on jobs and on businesses. But the need for emergency food has been increasing year on year for 5 years before the start of the pandemic. So the problem runs much deeper than that. Over the last 5 years, in fact, we've seen a 128% increase in demand for food aid within our network. We know that problems with the benefit system, more often than not due to its design, are a major driver of food bank use in this country. And research conducted by Heriot-Watt University on our behalf in the summer found that just under half, 47% of households surveyed at food banks were repaying money to the Department for Work and Pensions due to loans they were given or overpayments of benefits outside of their control. This is something that's built into the system that is causing people to need to use food banks. And this needs to change if our social security system is to serve as the safety net that we all need it to be. And this year has shown us that the system can change. Over the last year, the government has taken significant steps to protect people's incomes and protect people from poverty during a really challenging time. Over £270 million in additional funding for local welfare, and the crucial step of temporarily increasing universal credit and working tax credit by £20 per week have offered people dignity during the crisis and prevented tens of thousands from needing to seek help to feed themselves and their family. We recently commissioned some research from YouGov to help us better understand the difference that this uplift has been making to people. And the most common experience that people shared with us was that the uplift allowed them to reliably afford basics without, for example, having to go without food or ration the amount of time the heating was on. One person told us, "The uplift has made it possible to survive. Without it, I could not afford heating or electricity." Making this £20 uplift permanent has the potential to make a huge difference to people struggling to make ends meet, reducing the likelihood of people needing to use a food bank in the future. We believe that God cares deeply about the ways we treat one another interpersonally, but God also cares about the structures and systems by which we organise our society. We can see this concern woven into the story of God's people, whether in the year of Jubilee set out in the book of Leviticus or in the language of the prophets who cry out for justice and freedom for the oppressed. So what we're talking about needing here is a bigger vision. One that reaches out to people in our communities, yes, but one that is also about bringing transformation across our whole society. One that asks, what does it mean to loose the chains of injustice in our day? At the Trussell Trust, we are committing ourselves to the vision of ending the need for food banks. And we really believe it's possible. There isn't one silver bullet that will achieve it. It's a complex problem that requires real partnership and one that needs to be tackled in multiple ways at the same time. For us, there are 3 main aspects to this, and we call them changing communities, which is focused on financial and relational support in local communities. Changing minds, which seeks to build support for long-term solutions to acute poverty amongst the general public. And changing policy, which is about influencing policy decisions at all levels of government in ways that reduce the need for food banks. And we believe that as Christians, we have a vital part to play in each of these areas. For parliamentarians, this might be including advocating for policies that better protect people from poverty, working with and alongside people with lived experience of poverty to develop new solutions and approaches, or getting involved in the work of the APPG on ending the need for food banks. For church leaders, it might mean thinking about how you can prompt your congregations to ask questions about why it is that a food bank is needed in your local community. And for all of us, it might mean considering how we talk, campaign, and pray about poverty, exploring personally what it looks like for us to seek justice as well as show compassion. We know that our vision is really challenging, and it will only be achieved by working collaboratively with churches and other charities, with businesses, and with politicians and policymakers from across all parties. But the partnerships we've seen during the pandemic have given us plenty of reason to be confident that things can change when we work together And so I'm really excited to see what progress we can achieve collectively over the coming years as we work concertedly towards this goal of ending the need for food banks in the UK. Back to you, Bev.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so we now have some opening statements from each of our guests. And the first person that I'd like to ask to speak is Marcia D Cordova. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to welcome Marsha now.
Oh, hold on.
Thank you, Marsha.
Hello, hi. Good. Can you all hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, firstly, can I say good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel to discuss an issue that I know is close to everyone's heart. I'm sure most of you were at this morning's National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, and we saw the theme for that was a life beyond COVID and a renewed hope. And I think that we really all have going forward is to have hope. And, you know, Tom White's message was so powerful in that we have to lament, we have to forgive, and then we have to rebuild. And that is what we all have a duty and responsibility to do. But my biggest takeaway really was that call to action, because as we recover and we rebuild, I believe we all have a duty and a responsibility to not just do things differently, but we have to do things better. And partnership, working in partnership, is going to be so important and so crucial to that effort. We know that COVID has shone a light on the massive injustices and inequalities across society, and we can no longer ignore the poor, the marginalized, and those that are going hungry. And as already has been shared, you know, the work that the Trussell Trust do in terms of providing that food parcels for people is so crucially important. But also is meeting such a great need. But, you know, you are helping meet those needs and so forth, but that we have to do things better. The evidence and the data, as you rightly pointed out, is there. You know, we know what is happening in terms of food poverty and destitution out there. And, you know, as a body, as Christians, as believers, we all are there to really speak out against those injustices and looking for solutions. And as has already been highlighted, we've seen how our actions can really impact and bring about some change and some relief for those that are most in need. And we should all be advocates in wanting to see an end to food poverty. And you know, we will speak about this later, but, you know, issues like overhauling the social security system are going to be crucial factors to that. But in my own constituency, obviously I have a food bank based in my constituency, and I've seen the work that they have done over the past 15 months, and having to even move to a much larger venue where they can actually distribute food effectively. But, you know, I've spent time visiting them on several occasions, meeting both the staff and volunteers who are doing a fantastic job serving the Wandsworth community. But there are other food distribution charities as well that are also working in partnership, like Waste Not Want Not, who provide food parcels to individuals as well. But it's really important, as we all know, the role that the church play in this, because churches are really at the heart and soul of our communities. And over the past few months, you know, 15 months, they have really played a crucial role in meeting that need. And, you know, the biggest area that they've been doing that has been by providing food to those in need. And the fact that there has been such a need in the fifth richest economy, it really isn't good enough for us to be there. And there are many that have had to use food banks for the first increases in people having to claim universal credit or other forms of support. And because of the long wait that individuals have to be able to access that social security support, many are having to turn to food banks. And as I've said, families are having to do that for the first time. And it's really important that as we recover from this pandemic, we have to do it differently. And trust in their vision and why they've come about. It's really all about feeding the hungry and giving those who are in greatest need help and giving those in greater need support. But I'm so pleased to hear the long-term aim for the charity, but also for everybody and for all of us as Christians, has to be an end to the use of food banks. There cannot be a society where food banks are the norm. And to do that, which I know we're going to come on to, will require change. And I'm really hoping that as we all work together, we can see some of that change over not just the coming months, but the years to come as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Marsha. That was really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Our second opening remarks will come from Paul Woolley. Paul, thank you very much indeed. Over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion and addressing this really important topic. I'm delighted to do that. And I want to pay tribute to my fellow panelists, but also to the Trussell Trust in particular for the work that it is doing and has been doing, particularly in the context of the last year through the pandemic. I read your impact report and it is truly remarkable. So thank you. Now, in thinking about the subject this morning, I want to offer some brief observations about the respective roles of the state and the church and the wider voluntary sector in general, before talking about their role in addressing food poverty in particular. But before I do that, I want to draw attention to the fact that the contribution of the church isn't limited to church-based activity, to church-organised activity. In the National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast earlier, Mr. Speaker referred to the vital contribution that churches have made throughout the pandemic. And of course, that's right. And that contribution is seen not only through church-based activities, but through Christians in their everyday front lines as social workers, business people, politicians, NHS staff, teachers, office workers, retail staff. When Christians do their work on their front line as disciples of Jesus, that is the church making its contribution. It's not limited to church-based activity. But what is the role of the state? Well, the first point I want to make here is that government has a really important role in promoting the common good and human flourishing. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian, argued that the state existed not only to restrain evil, which it undoubtedly does, but to lead human beings to virtue. And I think that's right. Secondly, however, although the state has an important role to play, it's not all important. And there are significant limits to what government can and should do. The state should avoid overreaching itself morally, and there are some things that the state just isn't very good at. For example, the state isn't very good at engaging with people on a personal or individual basis. The state isn't very good at loving people. The state is contractual rather than covenantal. So if we take those two ideas together, that government has an important role to play on the one hand, but on the other hand, that role is limited. It seems to me that the role of government is to secure the social conditions that are necessary for the possibility of the common good. And one of the ways, of course, that government can do that is to enable the church to be the church and do its work. And the church is covenantal rather than contractual. So what could all of this mean in relation to food poverty? Well, firstly, government clearly has a really significant responsibility to address food poverty in view of the fact that food is not only essential for human flourishing, food is essential to human survival. Food is a basic physiological need right at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. Government should do everything reasonably possible to ensure that people do not need to resort to food banks. Clearly, there are various interventions government can make, and the efficacy of those interventions can, and no doubt we will, debate them. Secondly, though, government needs to recognise its own limitations and not overreach itself. Let me give you an example of where government has overreached itself, and this is from a friend of mine, the late Bob Holman. In 1976, Bob resigned as Bath University Professor of Social Administration, seeing his affluence and position as inconsistent with his Christian faith. And Bob and his wife, Annette, and 2 children, Ruth and David, moved to Easterhouse in Glasgow. The Easterhouse estate at the time was one of the most deprived in Europe. In response to the deprivation that existed in their community and the fact that some children were coming to school not only having not eaten, but having no shoes, Easterhouse Baptist Church, of which Bob was a part, opened a breakfast club for children. It was run by volunteers from the church, and the impact of that club on the lives of those children was absolutely extraordinary. It not only gave children the breakfast they needed, it also gave them the love that they craved. Friendship, acceptance, belonging, self-esteem, a network of adopted parents and grandparents. And the Breakfast Club soon started a homework club, and that was equally successful. Well, a few years later, the local authority established its own breakfast club on the estate without any consultation whatsoever with the church. The local authority run breakfast club had more money, and soon children drifted away from the church to it. But what the council-run breakfast club did not have were volunteers who were personally invested in the children, who lived where the children lived, who knew their parents. What the local authority-run club did have was a high turnover of staff who were either unable or unwilling to invest in the thing that those children needed most, human relationships. So my point here is that government needs to recognize its own limitations and the power of the voluntary sector and churches in particular. And there are times where government needs to give support and then get out the way. But if government needs to be careful, so do churches. How so? Well, firstly, churches need to be careful not to be simply co-opted as an arm of the state and lose their identity in the process. But churches should also be careful not to, through the very best of intentions, make matters worse. In the last year especially, churches have been quick to take the initiative and respond to need in their community. But when this is done without research or reference to other agencies or part of coordinated activity, such interventions can be harmful, they can be damaging, they can certainly be unsustainable. Those interventions can hurt the people that they're designed to help. And offering food is a good example of this, which is why networks like Trussell Trust are so important. Church interventions need to conform to best practice and be integrated. Hunger rarely exists in isolation. It's often part of a cluster of needs: low pay, debt, poor mental health, relationship breakdown. So engaging with and acting in cooperation with other agencies really matters. So to conclude, if government and churches and the voluntary sector work together, recognizing what their distinctive roles are, and develop integrated and holistic ways to address food poverty, it seems to me that a better future is possible. Now, just one final point, if I may. It doesn't seem to me possible to be able to address the issue of food poverty in our society without challenging our own levels of consumption and waste. We dispose of 6.4 million tons of perfectly good food every year. That's enough to fill Wembley Stadium 11 times over. That's immoral. And it's something that we need to address both at a personal and corporate level, however uncomfortable that makes us feel. Well, I hope that these thoughts have stimulated other thoughts in your minds and the minds of the panel, and I look forward to our discussion together. Bev, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. An awful lot there for us to kind of reflect on and to mull over in our own mind. Thank you so much for that breadth of information that you have just given us. Can I also invite those who are watching? There is a little box at the bottom called Q&A. Please feel free to write your questions in that little box there. I can assure you, if there are lots of questions, we will not get through all of them, but we can start some of them. Marsha and Emma, just before we hear our next speaker, could I ask you, is there anything that Paul said that you'd like to respond to initially?
If you want, I mean, for me, I think what Paul articulated the issues and how everybody has a role to play in ending food poverty, but and also kind of setting out how he sees those roles actually playing out, which I thought, you know, was quite spot on.
Thank you. Emma?
I thought there's so much in there, Paul, but I was really struck by that danger of us as a church community in our passion to respond with compassion can find ourselves co-opted as an arm of the state, and like being really attentive to that. And so for us at the Trussell Trust, it's about being really clear that we are providing emergency food, but it is at its very best a sticking plaster to a problem that is much, much greater. If somebody can't afford food, the likelihood is they're unable to afford their heating, secure housing, personal hygiene items, and therefore not accepting that food parcel as being enough. Providing what we can with compassion, but always saying this can't be the solution. This should not be the solution because it is insufficient. And I think holding intention, compassion, and justice is really tricky. And I think it is about really declaring what it is we can and cannot do. And the other thing Paul said that really struck me was about that ability, and I see it every time I walk into one of our food banks and see our volunteers providing that safe space where someone can come and share a cup of tea with someone and sit and just be at peace for a moment, and then start to maybe talk about how they're feeling in that situation. That is something very unique, I think, that we can provide as one neighbour to another in our communities that is very hard for the state to replicate. And I know that speaking to people once they've been to a food bank, often it's that interaction that has reignited some sense of hope, that and restored something of somebody's energy to be able to take that next step in the things they need to do to try and fix the situation that they're in. And so I that really resonated with me, that the different roles that we play, but also the danger that one can very easily be co-opted into a role that is absolutely not something we're fit for purpose to deliver.
And I echo that. And for me, the different roles, they may be different roles, but they cross over, and we need to have open communication with one another and pushing one another for the greater good. And sometimes we set up things without talking to one another. And that doesn't help the community by any stretch of anybody's imagination. But for me, the whole communication and listening will help us with that. Okay, so before we have any more open discussion, can I ask Danny? Danny, thank you for joining us. Can I ask you for your opening statement? We've just had a little bit of a conversation with each other, but it'd be helpful to have your input, and then we can have another open discussion together. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Hello, Danny, can you hear me?
Hello, yes, I can.
Hello. Thank you and welcome. So I was just asking if you were able to do your contribution, and then we'll have a wider discussion with each other.
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, my great pleasure. Well, thank you for having me, and sorry not to have been here at the beginning. I was on a call talking about universal credit, which is probably relevant. And this morning I had the pleasure of being at the Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast here in Devizes in Wiltshire, where St James's Church here in the town is just the most brilliant hub for all sorts of really positive social action historically and most dramatically during the last year. They stepped up before anybody else moved locally, before the lockdown was announced, to organise a whole network, and they had 300 people signed up to volunteer to help shielding and isolating households before day one of lockdown. So and then following that, what's been so inspiring is the way the wider systems have supported what the church was doing and got around it. So the town council and the Unitary Wiltshire Council opening their facilities and enabling what the church is doing, and equivalent civil society groups around the county. Food bank there's been a food bank in Devizes for some years, and others in our other towns, and we saw the enormous value that they contributed during the lockdown. A couple of points noticed that we need to think about as we emerge from this. I mean, one is and I don't know how widespread this is, but in Devizes there's been a real decline, a falling off of demand for the food bank in recent months, and that doesn't mean that the poverty, the problems that cause people to rely on food banks has reduced, but the demand has, in a sense, dissipated into other forms of support in the area, and as well as probably just gone underground. So I'm not claiming this as good news, although on the face of it, it's welcome that the demand does not seem to be quite so extreme. But for me, this represents the general phenomenon that we are going to see as we emerge from COVID, which is that the acute need, the really, frankly obvious presenting need that people have, whether that's for helpers if they're isolating that can be provided by volunteers doing their shopping for them, or it's immediate food poverty that can be relieved by a parcel of food, has been spread into much more diffuse and complex needs that are not going to be addressed in quite such straightforward ways. And I think we have a series of chronic social problems in our communities that were there before COVID, been exacerbated by COVID, and we need to build systems of resilience to support families and households. And I think the church and food banks and other support systems. Here we have a very active Christians Against Poverty group who work through the church, and they again find that debt is just the way into the conversation that they have with families, and they end up providing a whole range of much more complicated and informal support to households. Just inspired by the conversation I've just been having, which was with Joseph Rowntree Foundation and a group of other MPs about welfare and universal credit. I mean, what JRF is saying is that universal credit is a very important and useful step forward because it simplifies what was a very complicated system before, and it reduces the withdrawal rate of benefits, which makes it easier to get into employment because you can keep more of what you earn, but the rates are too low, and so the system is a better one, but the resourcing of it remains too low. And the great challenge for us as a country is how to put a stronger floor under people's incomes. And I will end with the observation that actually the level of welfare is, in a sense, secondary to the costs that families have, and the cost of housing is the great problem. So there's a holistic strategy. It's not just about what welfare payments we can provide. I think we have the right architecture of our welfare system, but we just need to get the resources right for it, and the wider social support that people need, which is where churches have such a crucial role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Danny. Okay, so what I'd like to do is, first of all, I'd like to read something that somebody wrote in chat, and then I'll look at some of the questions. So this is a comment that somebody made in chat. Food banks have an image problem. They're currently seen as a positive thing, which in some senses they are, but until the presence of food banks in our cities, towns, and villages evoke a sense of shame and a recognition that their existence is a failure of government on a massive scale, nothing will change. Okay, so I want you to hold that as a comment. And then I want to ask the question of the panel in general. What do panelists think is the one thing that could be done to bring about the end of food banks in their current form? Emma, can I start with you, please?
Indeed, thanks very much, Bev. So to respond first to that comment, I talk about this paradox that we live with as staff and as volunteers within the Food Bank Network on a daily basis, that the imperative to respond in compassion to a situation we're seeing in front of us, and a sense of devastation that we're having to do it at all, and that a desperate desire not to be there whilst feeling an imperative to respond. And I think that's kind of summed up in that comment. There is an image problem in part because the thing that has inspired me the most during the pandemic is the extraordinary response of people in their local communities, volunteers, people who've donated food, to step forward and say, this is not right that anyone is going hungry, and I want to respond. And that response is something to be celebrated. The need in itself and what is causing that need is something that we should be devastated by, and we must take action to do something about. But it's very hard as we sit on that line in between those two feelings, trying to respond with compassion but speak out for justice. And I was really struck by Danny's points there at the end of his opening statement around the fact that we have a mechanism through universal credit that was able to respond to a doubling in the number of people that had to come on to benefits as the pandemic kicked in, which was an extraordinary achievement of the system. But it provides too little money for people to be able to afford the essentials. And so until such times as we're addressing the fact that if somebody is unable to work, or because they're unwell, or because they've lost their job, that our social security provides them with enough income to afford the essentials, we're never going to be able to see an end to the need for food banks.
Okay, and can I ask Marsha if you could respond as well?
Yes, of course. So as we've all been impressed by, and we've all experienced and we've all witnessed just the great response to food hunger in our own local areas, that's absolutely right thing to do. We also need to address some of those drivers, and that's where we need fundamental change to the makeup of the economy, and a change to how systems work. A security system that unfortunately doesn't act as a safety net in a way that really does ensure that it meets the living standards of the individuals that require it. The universal credit system, in its authenticity in terms of wanting to simplify what was a very complex system, is one thing that we would all absolutely agree with. But the levels are low, as we know, but also there are so many complexities within the system in itself that enables many people to potentially be worse off if you claim it. So for instance, if you do claim universal credit for the first time, you have a very long period of time to wait before you receive your first payment. Now, none of us on this call, I believe, that are in work would have to wait 5 weeks, for instance, for our first wage packet. So it doesn't make any sense to have people having to wait such a long period of time to receive that first payment, which then puts them at the position where they need to rely on food parcels from somewhere, or they have to rely on asking for a loan to help them meet those immediate living costs until they receive that first payment. So that's just something that needs addressing. But then also we have to address the world of work and look at the future of work and what that means, because wages are low, as we know. We do have a living wage, but living standards because people still need to apply for social security as a top-up, and there's also the aspect of precarious work or insecure work as well. So if we can change the way we do social security by giving it an overhaul, but also changing the way that work is being delivered or the output of work is happening in our society now, then we can maybe start to see those changes. You know, we are a compassionate people. We have to be compassionate, and we have to be caring, and we have to be fair and just. And that's why we need a proper, good social security system that is there for those who need it. It has to be a safety net, because if it's one thing we've seen in my own constituency, I have seen huge increases of people having to claim universal credit for the first time as a result of this pandemic. And for them, I know that I've seen the challenges and I've heard about their experiences, and that system needs to change. Unless we see those fundamental changes, then we are going to continue in this cycle of the need to have food banks. And whilst there may be a place for them, as it stands in the current state of play, we do need to rethink this.
Thank you, Marsha. So Paul, can I switch the question on you, please, and ask you another question for you and for Danny. Has the role of education in budgeting and nutrition been considered? And this anonymous individual says, I've noticed in our local food banks that certain items which are neither nutritious nor needful are also requested.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Bev. I think that questioner draws attention to the fact that there is no silver bullet. There is no one action that will eradicate food banks. So even if universal credit was completely sorted, even if social security, the system was faultless, even if levels increased, because food poverty has multiple dimensions, such as debt, such as poor mental health, such as relational breakdown, etc., etc. That single intervention wouldn't be enough. So I think drawing attention, what I'm trying to say, to the role, for example, of education, and education in terms of nutrition, that is a further intervention that could be very helpful in dealing with the problem, and recognizing that there are various angles that we need to come at this problem with. And I think, you know, would it not be extraordinary if we could use the imagination, the innovation, the creativity that we have shown in developing a vaccine and rolling it out? Could we not use that imagination, creativity, and nimbleness to look at this problem of food poverty? Because we're capable of it, but it will require us to do things differently. And I think it does require this integrated approach, which is recognizing, if we like, multiple need, but also the existence of multiple agencies, government and the voluntary sector. And of course, churches are a key part of that.
Thank you very much indeed. Somebody has written 3 questions here, so I think I should at least ask one of them. And this one is specifically to Annie Kruger. I think this is more of a local question. The same drop-off, the use of food banks, is the same situation that we are seeing in Cale, C-A-L-N-E, your neighbour constituency. I don't know whether it was a question or a comment, but did you know what that is relating to?
Cairn, yes, yeah, another Wiltshire town. Well, I mean, I spent the morning last week, the week before, with our Devizes food bank manager, whose observation I tried to reflect in my remarks, which is that, you know, she doesn't think there's any sort of reduction in overall poverty or the sort of social crisis that we have. It's just being diffused and possibly picked up by the network of civil society that has been mobilized through the pandemic. I mean, as I said, we've had an extraordinary response here of people stepping up and their relationships, connections, neighbourhood friendships that exist now that didn't exist 18 months ago. And people might have been able to find the help that they weren't aware of before. Or it's just gone back into the, as it were, into the social network. I mean, I think I'd be interested to know the research on the degree to which food bank use, the increase in food bank that we've seen over the last 10 years and more, reflects what we call a displacement rather than new demand. So where people that experience poverty, traditionally they would seek help from family, friends and neighbours, the church and other sources, and now they're being signposted to the food bank. So obviously there has been growth. We're very familiar with it, and the work I've done before I was in politics brought that very strongly home to me. But there's a displacement element to this, and that need might have been displaced back in recent months. And whether that's good or bad, I can't really judge, because it's not obvious that it's better that less formal means of support are being provided. It might be that the help that people really need isn't getting provided to them in a way that it can be if you come to the food bank through a properly organised support system. I mean, just so quickly, if I may, I'll try and give a sentence or two in response to the earlier question. I mean, I agree with Paul. There's no single answer, and I agree with what others have been saying. It is about benefit levels. It is about the role of employers. I think the social security system receives an enormous amount of burden because employers don't do their job properly in terms of delivering decent work conditions to people. They then fall into benefits, and then beyond that they fall into food bank use. So that further up the chain, we need employers behaving better, we need landlords behaving better. So there's a big private sector responsibility here that we need to get right. We need to fix our housing market. And as I think Marsha was saying, there's a whole piece around the future of work and, you know, people living in precarious gig economy kind of jobs, which is in a sense the future, and needn't be all bad. You know, it's what more rich professional people call portfolio life. You know, not doing the same job forever. That's not a bad thing in itself, but we've got to have a security system that can support people in that new, much more potentially precarious world of work. And I would like to see a return to the old sort of pre-welfare state model of trade unions, local mutual support systems, alongside a really good, well-resourced welfare system that can provide the skills support, employment support, and the more informal kind of social advice and help that people need. So it's not just your family and your job, but there's a hinterland of civil society that supports you locally, alongside what the state absolutely needs to get right.
Okay, thank you. And this is the last question. There are going to be two last questions, but I think we'll only have one. So this is for all of you, and you've literally got a minute each with this one, which is not very long. How can the church use its position in society to tackle the root causes of poverty? Should churches, Christians, be getting themselves involved in politics? Okay, so where shall I start? Shall I start with Paul?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes, of course the church should get involved in politics, and the evidence that it is doing that is on this panel. So, you know, the reality is that the gospel should not be conflated to political action. Politics deals with enforceable law. The gospel is bigger than that, but the ramifications of the gospel are immense and multidimensional and absolutely deal with government policy. And I agree with Desmond Tutu, who said that I don't know what Bible people are using if they think religion and politics don't mix. Of course they mix. I mean, politics is about these fundamental questions, how we organize ourselves. And we bring our ideas to that. And I mean, and the other point is just to say that, you know, this isn't, everyone comes to politics with faith. No one stands nowhere. We all come with an ideology, a worldview, a framework that we are seeking to bring. And most of us are well motivated in doing that. So yes, and I think this is where, you know, churches have a role in terms of individual Christians, church-based activity, but then also in terms of providing help and support. But that's often not necessarily at the root cause, although in churches it often is dealing with root causes, because it's dealing with isolation and loneliness, often unemployment. So in a sense, churches can be dealing with root causes there. But yeah, this is, again, everyone has a part to play, and churches absolutely need to get involved. I think Emma drew attention to this twin role of activism and campaigning. One of the things the church does, of course, is to hold the government to account, and that is entirely appropriate.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Marsha, you need to take yourself off mute.
You'd think by now we'd all know how to unmute ourselves, but anyway, can I say I think Paul articulated that so well. I mean, first off, of course the church should be involved, and the church are involved. We do have bishops that are sat in the House floor, so they certainly are. But ultimately, the church has a role in trying to influence, not in just issues of poverty and so forth, but there are so many other social issues that the church really should be advocating and also trying to influence, which again they certainly are doing. And there are many live issues that the church should be involved in. But the churches are, as I say, they are part of our communities and they know the need, and the churches are meeting the need. But some of those root causes do require, proper fundamental change within systems and institutions, and that requires the government, and that requires business and so forth, and obviously civil society. But the church are also meeting those needs as well. I think Paul also alluded to some of those needs that are already being met, and they do them locally, and that is why the local church is so important, as well as the corporate body whole. But it's all how we translate things down to a local level and meeting those needs at a local level that really makes a difference to those local communities. And then you've got it at the more corporate, broader level, where you can actually be influencing policy, influencing government, and bringing about those changes that we need. But everybody has a role and a responsibility, not just as Christians, but also as individuals, to tackle those injustices and inequalities that we see across society. Today, it's really focusing around food poverty, but we know that the drivers to that also come from insecure work, poor housing, and so forth. And all of those issues marry up, and we all have to deal with them because they thread together to cause inequality, and that's what we really need to be seeking to challenge and overcome.
Thank you very much indeed. And next, let's go to Danny.
Well, I think, I agree with that, and Emma and Paul. I think absolutely Christians should be involved in politics, speaking their mind and getting actively involved. I think there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's quite appropriate for Christian leaders as well, people in the public eye in the church, to be commenting on policy and critiquing the government, or even supporting the government. Wouldn't that be interesting? On policy, but as long as they realise they're in a political ground, and there'll be pushback, but I think absolutely they should. I regret it when church leaders get stuck into politics in the purest sense and start critiquing individuals, or getting partisan, saying never trust a Tory, that sort of thing. I disapprove of. But I think it's quite right as citizens and leaders in the public square to be speaking into politics. Where I think the great value of church leadership is in cultural leadership, and the more we hear from church leaders about the sort of society we want to be, what it is to be human, deep questions about personhood and life and death, these are the questions that should be discussed in public and by our church leaders, and they can help frame those discussions really well. I think there's a big role for national leadership and narrative and culture setting that I hope to, I like seeing from the church. But mostly, as Marsha just said, it's about witness and practice, and we as Christians should be, inspiring people through our work locally and in our professions to realise that there's something perhaps that we've got right and that might be worth emulating, not us as people, but just because of the spirit that's in us. And I applaud every person of faith who brings their faith to work, and I think we should definitely protect that among Christians.
Thank you very much indeed. And Emma.
It's a great question, and I think I would agree with Danny that it's not about partisan politics, but our responsibility to engage with politics in the wider sense. And our politicians govern by consent. And so actually the conversations we have in our church communities as leaders within churches, we can see the role the church has had in terms of providing compassionate response, but starting to have those conversations that spark justice, that talk about how do we loose the chains of injustice in our day? What are the structures in our society that we as Christians should be challenging, that we should be asking our elected officials to change and make right? I think is powerfully at the heart of what it means to be a Christian, what we're called to by Jesus in the Bible, what is the very essence of being a Christian. I think the church has a really powerful role to play in changing the minds of us as the general public, but also then together bringing our voices together to ask for change that is about justice and transformation.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I'd like to personally thank each of you for your contribution, unique and challenging in every way. And just to end, I'd like to say that we are called as Christians to love our neighbour as we love ourselves. And that includes, for me, loving my neighbour, it means that I care about the laws that govern us as well, and how we can interact with that to make a just and better world for each of us and for our community. Thank you, each of you, and bless you for the work that you actually do. And I pray that one day in our communities, we will see the end of food banks. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I lost my job. I was in a really bad way. I was struggling to meet the bills, just feeding the children. I was going without food just so that they ate. The first time I used it, I was really anxious, really scared, didn't know what to expect. I thought that I'd let people down because I was having to ask for help. I'm quite a proud person and I don't like people to think that I'm struggling. But yeah, it was hard to do.
Over the recent years, we've seen more and more people come into food banks for emergency food because they can't even afford the basics. And the pandemic has pushed even more people into extreme poverty. Churches are vital to the work of food banks. They open up their buildings, donate food, provide volunteers and leaders, and show amazing care and compassion to people who need emergency food and support. And will continue to work together to provide this support for as long as it's needed. Food banks are doing an incredible job, but no one wants to have to use a food bank to be able to feed their family. And it isn't right that so many people are needing to.
It's so important that food banks don't become the new normal. All of us depend on other people for our well-being, whether that's our families, friends, employers, businesses, or public services. And what we see at the food bank is that often it is people who have the least in our communities who are most affected by the decisions we make as a society about things like benefits, housing, and employment. Unless these decisions come to better reflect the principles of dignity and compassion, justice, and community, we will continue to see people being trapped in poverty and unable to enjoy a fuller life that Jesus intends for us all. As Christians, we need to be seeking justice and advocating for change, as well as showing compassion to people facing a crisis.
So at the Trussell Trust, we want to work together with food banks, with churches, with communities, businesses, local and national governments, for a more compassionate and just society, where no one needs emergency food, because we all have enough money for the essentials. That's why we're inviting you to join us in building a hunger-free future, a future without the need for food banks.